Welcome back to the Infinite Jungle. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the main takeaways of all core developers consensus call number 153, where developers confirmed that the Hoodi testnet is indeed live. It is up and running. Developers also reconfirmed on the call when the Pectra upgrade will happen on the Hoodi testnet. And they also deliberately refrained from picking any date for Pectra mainnet activation. Developers said that they will wait and see how the Hoodi testnet upgrade goes before picking any mainnet date. We're going to get into the Hoodi upgrade timeline, which has been confirmed and is already scheduled. We'll also talk about two more technical topics that was discussed on the call: history expiry and a new EIP 7688. So that's what we're going to get into in today's show. Before we get started, here is a quick show disclaimer. I need to remind you to please refer to the disclaimer linked in the podcast show notes, and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice, an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy Digital or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. So let's get started with an update on Pectra testing. Hoodi is scheduled to go through the Pectra upgrade on Wednesday, March 26th at 14:37 UTC, which for my fellow East Coasters in the U.S., that is going to be 10:37 a.m. ET on Wednesday. So by the time that you are listening to this episode, it will be a Tuesday. And so get ready for the Hoodi testnet upgrade. Fingers crossed it goes well. If you are an infrastructure provider, if an Ethereum infrastructure node provider, if you are an application developer on Ethereum and you want to test out Pectra features, please start moving your infrastructure immediately from Holeshi testnet to the Hoodi testnet. Hoodi is live and it's about to go through the upgrade. There are a couple of client teams that as of Friday, which is when we're recording this call, a day after the ACD call, there are a couple of client teams that hadn't yet released updated software for the Hoodi testnet, but all client teams, at least on the call, did say that they are very close to doing so and will be ready to do that, release any updated releases for Hoodi over the weekend. So by the time you're listening to this episode, all of those releases should be out. So people that are running nodes, wanting to test their validator setups, any applications that are wanting to deploy any smart contracts and see it function through the Pectra upgrade, Hoodi testnet is where to do it. So reminder to all of our listeners that is happening. I'm going to link in the show notes a blockchain explorer site where you can watch the upgrade happen in real time. It's called Dora the Explorer, but it's and they have these explorer sites. Developers have created these blockchain explorer sites for all of the testnets. This one is going to be specifically for Hoodi, so everyone can watch it as it happens live. And I'll also give an update on how it goes, of course, in next week's Infinite Jungle monologue episode. And so developers talked about that being the next immediate step for Pectra testing. There was a comment left on the call agenda about potential dates for Pectra, the upgrade going live on Ethereum mainnet. Developers deliberately said we're not going to pick a mainnet date quite yet. There's still a bit of Pectra testing they want to do first before feeling confident enough to set a date. As a reminder to my Infinite Jungle listeners, I maintain that it's very, very unlikely that developers will pick any mainnet date in April. By the time that they are comfortable and confident about Pectra testing and feel confident enough to pick mainnet dates, I think the earliest that developers will set a date for Pectra on mainnet is sometime in May. But if there are major bugs again or disruptions seen on the Hoodi testnet, either because of the Pectra code itself or some other part of the Ethereum code base that developers need to reevaluate and reassess, I do maintain that Pectra could happen even later, perhaps sometime in June. So May or later is definitely the estimation that I have and am working off of for now. We'll see how the Hoodi testnet upgrade goes next Wednesday, and I think that will give a lot more color on whether May is as we can feel as confident about May, more confident about the May timeline for the Pectra upgrade on mainnet. So that is the Pectra testing updates. Developers did talk about one other timeline and testing timeline that is somewhat dependent on the Pectra upgrade timeline, and that is the timeline for history expiry. Developers for several months have the client teams that create software for connecting to and validating the Ethereum blockchain. These client teams for several months have been working on history expiry, which is an effort to deprecate, throw away old block and transaction data from the Ethereum blockchain. Right now, anytime you operate a full node on Ethereum, that node will host all of the historical data of past transactions and block data since basically the genesis of Ethereum. This is a lot of data, and for developers to encourage more users to operate a node, they want to minimize the requirements for doing so as much as possible. This is an effort to increase the decentralization of Ethereum, to make it as easy as possible for anyone in the world to connect to Ethereum and validate the blockchain themselves without having to rely on third-party service providers like Infura that operates nodes on people's behalfs. The whole point of public blockchains is to disintermediate third parties. So as much as possible, developers want to put infrastructure and power and being able to utilize the Ethereum blockchain directly into the hands of its users. And one of these efforts to make the requirements for operating a node a lot easier and a lot lighter, make the computational resources and kind of disk space. Honestly, I'm not a super technical person, so I'm not 100% sure if it's called disk space, but basically amount of storage you might need to operate a full node. And to reduce that, developers are thinking of and have been working towards something called history expiry, and to basically, more specifically, drop all of the history from before Ethereum transitioned into a proof-of-stake blockchain. This proof-of-stake transition happened in 2022, I believe, so all of the data from 2015, block and transaction data, to 2022, dropping that, and for an alternative decentralized peer-to-peer network for users to be able to retrieve that data if they need it from alternative networks. One of the alternatives is the Portal network. Another alternative, of course, is using third-party services like Infura actually to get that kind of data. But to be able to keep the bare bones of what you would need to validate the Ethereum blockchain and to connect to it to a minimum, because that history data is not necessary or doesn't have to be necessary for individuals to be able to run an Ethereum node. So that effort has been ongoing for probably over a year now. And developers said in last December, that they would set a deadline for all client teams to have their history expiry strategies and plans ready to go, ready to operate, and ready to start by May 1st of this year. One of the reasons why they set a deadline, and kind of an arbitrary deadline for themselves, is because history expiry impacts client behavior, the software of the client, but it doesn't actually require any changes to the protocol. So it's not as though there are EIPs or code changes that have to be activated right at an upgrade, like Pectra upgrade or like Fusaka upgrade. There is no kind of forcing function for history expiry to happen by a certain fork upgrade, by a certain upgrade. Client teams can actually roll this out whenever they want. But the reason why they want to kind of synchronously do this is so that they can also track the messaging between nodes. They want to make sure that there is sufficient alternatives for users to be able to retrieve history data that has been expired. And so long as all of the client teams are on the same page about some clients may not be able to service certain historical data. Here's how nodes should be able to communicate that error message of, this data is now expired. Please go find it somewhere else. These kinds of activations do require a certain amount of coordination, but it's not coordination that impacts the core protocol of Ethereum. It really impacts the networking layer of Ethereum, which is why for several years, actually, this history expiry effort has been delayed. Developers have been very focused on shipping upgrades, and these ACD calls are oftentimes, most of the time is spent on testing upgrades. And these upgrades like history expiry and changing the client behavior is not always prioritized on these calls. It's not easy to prioritize when there isn't a forcing function like an upgrade happening for it. So that's why developers in December said, okay, look, we're not going to push this off any longer. Yes, Pectra is happening, but this is just as important to the decentralization and health of Ethereum. Let's set a date for ourselves, May 1st. Now, in December, when they set that May 1st deadline, they were very, very confident that by the time May 1st rolled around, Pectra would have already happened on mainnet. Developers do usually get ahead of themselves in this way a lot, but they were very optimistic in December. They said, of course, Pectra will be live on mainnet by May 1st. But lo and behold, Pectra timeline has become delayed a bit, and it's not likely that Pectra will go live by May 1st. Pectra will likely go live later, sometime later, perhaps mid or late May, perhaps even June, as we've already discussed. But this creates some complications for the history expiry timeline because in Pectra, there is an EIP 6110, that changes how validator deposit transactions are processed and validated on chain. And so if history expiry happens before Pectra, then some clients may not have those transactions. They might expire the validator deposit transactions that have happened before the merge. As a reminder also to my listeners, the proof of stake blockchain, the beacon chain of Ethereum went live a couple of years, 2 years, I think, before the merge actually happened. So users were actually able to stake on Ethereum, deposit, spin up validators, earn staking rewards before the merge happened. Now, they couldn't exit their validators. This was kind of like a one-way street at the time. It was very risky. But now you can. So back then, there are some transactions that have happened before the merge, and those transactions would be expired if client teams did still coordinate on the May 1st date. But this creates complications for nodes that are going to be syncing to Ethereum when the Pectra upgrade goes live and is using EIP 6110 because it changes the behavior of these validator deposit transactions. This creates complications for how nodes sync to Ethereum, how that code change EIP 6110 is activated. Developers do not want to be messing with the history of validator deposit transactions right before they activate EIP 6110 on-chain, right before they activate the Pectra upgrade on-chain. And so developers talked about on the latest call, how do we, either create a workaround so that they don't have to worry, they can still keep the May 1st history expiry deadline, but create some kind of a workaround so that the validator deposit transactions, when that behavior changes in Pectra, the history expiry efforts don't complicate that code change and doesn't create any edge cases or kind of bugs that developers need to fix. The second option, of course, is just to simply delay, push back the May 1st deadline that they had set way back in December when they didn't know, all of these complications on the Pectra testnets, on the Ethereum public testnets would happen. Just push back the May 1st deadline until to some deadline after Pectra actually goes live. And initially on the call, developers did discuss, well, what if we simply make it so that instead of history, dropping all of the history from before the merge, they simply drop all of the history before the beacon chain launch, before it was even possible to have validated repository transactions. So that means all of the transaction and block data before 2020, before when the beacon chain launched, all of that data can be dropped, and none of those transactions, none of that data would include any validator deposit transactions, and hence when Pectra does go live, then there wouldn't be any concerns about the way the behavior of EIP6110 is impacted, because all that validator deposit transaction data is still there, still supported by client software. One of the developers, Geth developer, like client, he kind of pushed back on this because this could create even more work for developers to create a history, to change their history expiry plans so that the history expiry happens up until the beacon chain launch instead of up until the merge date. To drop that history. And then once the Pectra upgrade goes live, to be able to then update again the client behavior so that they do actually drop pre-merge history, so that they can actually fulfill the initial kind of plan that they had to drop all of the history data of Ethereum from 2015 all the way to 2022. So like Klein was saying, that it might just be simpler to simply push back the May 1st deadline. And just as a side note too, the way that history expiry, the strategies that each of the client teams are taking to history expiry is going to be slightly different. Again, this is not a hard fork, so the behavior of clients does not have to be exactly the same for how they support the full history of the Ethereum blockchain. Some clients will continue to require that users that are operating a full node with their client, they maintain the full history of the Ethereum blockchain. Other clients, for performance reasons and for performance improvements, will choose to drop that history and then offer these other ways in which users can source the expired data. But the one thing that all clients will have to coordinate on is the endpoints, the communication between how nodes share what is data that cannot be requested from that particular node, and what is data that can be, what is historical data that is still available to request. And this is called the communication between nodes is dictated by something called the Ethereum Wire Protocol. And so one of the developers on the call was saying that there still needs to be consensus on the new Wire Protocol versioning, new Wire Protocol version for these nodes to be able to communicate with one another once history expiry goes live. Once there is coordination between clients, and some clients do actually drop history expire. Because for now, I believe all clients are servicing the full history, but after that point, there will be some clients that will drop and start pruning out history more regularly. And this will become more of a common trait among Ethereum nodes, which is not the case right now. So yes, so the first option, of course, was to create some kind of a workaround. But as Light Client was saying, to keep that May 1st deadline, it seems to overly complicate things. Let's just push back the May 1st deadline. And developers didn't really come to a consensus at all on this call about their strategy for history expiry, but it is clear that some kind of a delay to the history expiry timeline will be needed, and will be what happens in light of the fact that Pectra mainnet timeline is also delayed. One of the other options that was shared by Perry, Ethereum Foundation DevOps engineer, Perry was sharing that what developers could do is keep the May 1st deadline, but for the Sepolia testnet. So have all client teams drop pre-merge history data on the Sepolia testnet. Make sure that the wire protocol versioning is rolled out on Sepolia, is correct, that the nodes are communicating with one another. Basically test all the history expiry strategies of all the client teams on the Sepolia testnet, and make sure that all client teams are ready with their code by May 1st on the Sepolia testnet and be testing that. Once the Pectra mainnet, once Pectra goes live on Ethereum mainnet, then developers can pick a date for rolling out history expiry on Ethereum mainnet. So keep the May 1st deadline, but simply change it so that the May 1st deadline is actually for rolling all the history expiry stuff out for Sepolia testnet. Wait until Pectra goes live on mainnet before setting a date for history expiry on mainnet thereafter. I think that might be the strategy that developers end up going with. It seems the most logical to me to move forward with. So that is probably what's most likely going to happen, but I'll definitely share an update on what developers do end up deciding. They're going to bring it up again on the next ACD call for further discussion. And I will note that tomorrow's Infinite Jungle episode is with one of the developers at the Ethereum Foundation that is leading history expiry efforts. So for more information on history expiry and for this discussion on why it's so important and the likelihood of what's going to happen for history expiry, perhaps even beyond Pectra mainnet, I'm going to be talking with Piper Miriam from the Ethereum Foundation about history expiry. So please do stay tuned for that episode, which is coming out tomorrow. One very last topic that I wanted to raise that was also raised on the ACD call. One of the obviously developers talk about quite a bit on these calls. They're about an hour and a half. Although yesterday's was a bit shorter, I will say. The consensus layer calls are actually a bit shorter than the execution layer calls. I chalk that up to different moderator styles between Tim and between Alex. Alex chairs the consensus layer calls. Anyways, the only other topic that I really want to highlight from all that developers talked about yesterday, because I think it's important to think about when we think about the scope of the next Ethereum upgrade, Fusaka, is developers' discussion around EIP 7688. This EIP is an EIP that is formally proposed for inclusion in the next Fusaka fork. And Dmitry Gusakov from the Lido DAO, Dmitry, my listeners should know who he is because he's been on the show before as a guest. I love it when on these calls, the people that I quote and the people that are talking are the people that we've already had on the show, because then you know kind of their background and these are not unfamiliar random voices. So Dmitry, who we know and love, Dmitry showed up onto the call and he shared why, from the Lido team's perspective, EIP 7688 is very important to include in the next upgrade in Fusaka. EIP 7688 changes the organization of data on the consensus layer / beacon chain. The consensus layer data is structured in these Merkle trees, and one of the concerns that applications and smart contracts have when they are interacting or reading data from the consensus layer is that any future upgrades that Ethereum has, for example, PeerDAS, for example, of course, Pectra coming up, these upgrades do contain EIPs that will impact the way that data is read and the way that data is structured in the consensus layer. One of the terms that was used quite a bit on the call is that when you have these kinds of EIPs, there is a chance that code changes that impact the consensus layer data structure, it will re-index the entire Merkle tree. So EIP 7688 organizes the data in such a way where data is organized into containers, and these containers are very forward compatible. So even though there are changes like PeerDAS, even though there are these kinds of EIPs, the data that is in these containers will not shift around and be re-indexed and kind of force every application that is reading that data or relies on that data from the consensus layer to also have to upgrade along with the Ethereum blockchain. So this EIP 7688, which I believe is called Forward Compatible consensus data structures or something along those lines. I'll link to the EIP in the show notes for any listeners that want to take a deeper look. This EIP was already recommended by a Nimbus developer, Etan Kisling. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. I'm sorry, Etan, if I said your name wrong. But Etan did propose EIP 7688 for the Pectra upgrade. And he proposed it primarily because he said there is a code change, EIP 4788. This is the code change in Pectra that is going to change consensus layer data structure. And it basically will allow smart contracts on the execution layer to be able to read data from the consensus layer in a very permissionless way. So this exposes, the more technical term is that exposes the beacon root to the execution layer. This is a pretty big change and a big deal for smart contracts on Ethereum because it allows smart contracts that are dealing with validator operations, so i.e. Lido, staking pools, Rocket Pool. It allows them to be able to permissionlessly be able to get the validator balances of active validators on Ethereum, to be able to read those balances from the consensus layer directly. It will allow trustless withdrawals to be able to, for smart contracts to be able to trigger withdrawals on the consensus layer. It's a pretty powerful EIP. And this EIP is going live in Pectra. And now when this EIP was included into Pectra, Etan recommended, well, we should probably include EIP 7688 as well, so that these applications that are relying on EIP 4788, they don't have to be forced to upgrade with Ethereum every time an upgrade happens. Because anytime there's another change to the consensus layer data structure, this means that any kind of application that is relying on consensus layer data, there is a very high chance that they will have to upgrade along with Ethereum so that they can maintain compatibility and maintain their ability to read data from the consensus layer correctly. So this is basically what Dimitri said as well. Dimitri said that now that EIP 4788 is going live in Pectra, EIP 7688 would be a great add-on because, again, there is a very high chance that as consensus layer data is used more heavily by these applications and smart contracts on the execution layer, any further changes to that consensus layer data, which is definitely coming through upgrades like Fusaka, which includes Pure DAS, this just ensures that EIP 7688 ensures that these applications don't have to upgrade with Ethereum every single time Ethereum hard forks. And I'm getting confused because there's so many numbers, but it's really just two EIPs, EIP 4788, but these EIPs have very similar numbers. EIP 4788 is the EIP that is going into Pectra. EIP 7688 is the one proposed for Fusaka. And this is the forward compatible consensus data structures. That's EIP 7688. And so Dimitri was making the case for EIP 7688 to go into Fusaka at the very least, even though Etan did propose it actually for Pectra. But again, developers said at the time Pectra is already too large. We're going to have to let EIP 7688 go. But lo and behold, it's an EIP that is needed by the applications, or that is strongly wanted by applications. And it wasn't just Dimitri. So Dimitri was the one who was representing the Lido team and sharing that. But EF Nixo, who we've also had on the show, part of the Ethereum Foundation protocol support team, Nixo, she posted in the Zoom chat comments by Rocket Pool, another staking pool that is on Ethereum that also shared similar sentiments to Dimitri. The Rocket Pool comment was basically saying the same thing, that EIP 7688 would be very beneficial to their application. And Etan chimed into this whole discussion, and he also mentioned another pro to EIP 7688, which is not just that it'll ensure that applications don't have to upgrade with Ethereum every single time Ethereum upgrades or changes the consensus layer data structure. He also mentioned that a benefit of EIP 7688 is for developers, Ethereum developers themselves, that want to simplify the beacon chain. There are parts of the beacon chain data structure that are now obsolete or will become obsolete after Pectra. For example, developers are activating a change in the validator activation process and the validator deposit process, where all deposits, new validator deposits, are primarily processed on the execution layer side, and there's no additional rounds of voting that's needed on the consensus layer side. So these things like validator deposit voting on consensus layer, on the consensus layer, these are things that developers can deprecate. But if they deprecate it without EIP 7688, there is the concern that it'll re-index the entire consensus layer Merkle tree. So Yitan was sharing that there are obsolete aspects of the consensus layer data structure that could be removed more easily if developers implement EIP 7688 and introduce these containers, these like forward compatible consensus layer data containers that will ensure that developers can make changes to the consensus layer data structure without worrying about how it impacts the rest of the consensus layer data structure, the Merkle tree. I know this is very technical, but hopefully this is very interesting to my listeners. Let's get into the takeaway of why I actually brought this up. So as you can see, EIP 7688 has a lot of benefits. It is benefits for developers that want to simplify and cut out dead code from the beacon chain. It's a code change that the likes of major stakeholders on Ethereum, like Lido and Rocket Pool, are really vying for, are really advocating for in Fusaka. Developers said on the call, for now, no major decision, no formal decision on whether or not EIP 7688 goes into Fusaka. They said, as we've said before on prior calls, we're not going to make the same mistake as Pectra and just start shoving in a ton of EIPs. We're going to make sure that PeerDAS, which has already been approved for inclusion into Fusaka, we're going to make sure that the EIPs we've included into Fusaka are more or less implemented, are further along in their implementations. Developers are ready and feeling more confident about PeerDAS before they include anything else. So they're going to make sure that they have a working, multi-client, stable DevNet where PeerDAS is live and has data availability sampling, has all the main components of what they'd like in PeerDAS before they formally approve any other EIPs into the Fusaka upgrade. That was the decision made on the call. But it's from the way that EIP 768 was talked about, I don't think that it's likely that PeerDAS will be the only code change in Fusaka. I think that there is a compelling case, as I said, from EIP 7688, but there's also a compelling case for other code changes, especially code changes that will help clients safely raise the Ethereum block gas limit. There are already client teams that are testing out increases in the Ethereum block gas limit. Some of which were talked about on the call, but I'm not going to get into those. You can get into those with the call notes that will be linked into the show notes of this episode. But there are a variety of code changes that I think there's already quite a bit of support that's building for them. Even though they're not formally included into Fusaka yet, I think there are code changes like these that have a very high chance of inclusion into Fusaka. And because of this, because developers are doing their best, of course, to keep the scope of Fusaka limited, I do think that there is a high chance that the Fusaka upgrade could grow in scope over the course of time to be just as large as Pectra. And I think the inclusion of even just one EIP into Fusaka, there will be concerns that it delays the activation of PeerDAS overall. And that kind of debate, that kind of discussion between the inclusion of these smaller code changes, these code changes that are definitely, in comparison to PeerDAS, less complex and easier to test, but they still require some amount of effort to get them properly tested and implemented. I think it will create quite a bit of contention among developers. So my takeaway is Pectra is about wrapping up, but my listeners should get ready and buckle up for what I expect will be yet another quite quite contentious scoping discussion for the Fusaka upgrade. And I do foresee that the Fusaka upgrade, as careful as developers are being about making sure that no code changes are formally accepted into the upgrade until PeerDAS is fully spec'd out, or very, very close to being fully spec'd out. I think there is a high chance that because there's such strong support for these other smaller code changes, that they also get into the upgrade, and eventually developers end up with a pretty large upgrade of a size that is similar, if not, who knows, larger than Pectra, if that's even possible. So that is something to look forward to, something that I think is already, Fusaka scoping discussions are already starting to percolate on these calls and bubble up. And I just think we're going to see more of that take center stage on the ACD calls moving forward. Thank you, everyone, for listening to another episode of The Infinite Jungle. I hope that you learned something new about Ethereum, and I hope that you will tune in again next week. Please do stay tuned, of course, for the episode tomorrow, that going deeper into history expiry with Piper Miriam. That's coming out tomorrow. I am signing off from the concrete jungle that is New York City. In your explorations of the infinite jungle that is Ethereum, stay safe out there.